If I could just introduce our guest speaker. Mark Logan's the Member of Parliament for Bolton North East. He is not, I think he would not describe himself necessarily as a career politician, because he's done many other things. He's been working in the private sector. He's been involved in management consultancy. He spent over 10 years in China, working in the Foreign Office with the sort of commercial portfolio, looking at inward investment into the UK, amongst other things. And he was first elected in December 2019, one of those swing seats that went from Labour to the Conservative Party with a very small majority of 378. So we were just talking before this, and he himself hasn't actually physically spent very long in the Houses of Parliament, because it's all been done virtually like this, of course. And he was elected into the Select Committee as his first Select Committee in the early part of last year. And today we're going to hear a little bit about his personal background, his views of the Select Committee, and the work that they've been undertaking. So thank you very much, Mark, for joining us. And if I could ask you and invite you to switch your camera on and say a few words. I'll switch my camera off and I'll come back in once you've finished speaking. So Mark, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I was just thinking it'd be great if you could always do the introductions for me in the future, because that was incredibly kind. And of course, for inviting me this evening to speak with all of the community at RSB. And I would just like to, before I go into a very short spiel, say that I also would like to echo what Mark has said about all the great work that people have been doing over the course of these last incredibly difficult 12 months for everyone in the UK, but also globally as well. I'd just like to start off by saying that, the baggage that I bring tonight is quite different to my colleague, who some of you may have heard last time with these RSB sessions from the Select Committee. In that, I mean, if you actually rummage around in my school baggage from back in the day, you'd be very hard pressed to find any biology textbooks. And I mean, come to think of it, there was maybe a double science kind of nutshell or dummies guide to book at the very bottom of the bag. But that's exactly why I wanted to take part tonight in what will be kind of less about me making a huge keynote speech and more about myself getting ideas from you guys, the experts. Because I am part of the problem. Don't edit that out, because someone is going to use that in future political campaigns. But I'm a product of our education system, or the trends in the air that my time growing up in, say, the Blair or other administrations, and the sorts of priorities were set in motion. And if we think back to those days, we had education was repeated 3 times over, when in actual fact it should have been biology, biology, biology. And as Mark has alluded to, my professional background is more in international affairs and social sciences, as opposed to the hard sciences. One of the biggest challenges and opportunities we are faced with is how do we get more young people interested in both fundamental and applied scientists. And I mean, if you just take the example of my own membership of the House of Commons Science and Technology Select Committee, 1 month into my new MP job, so I was elected in December 2019, but I think it was towards the end of January then, 2020, a senior colleague passed me in the corridors of power, or it might have actually been the canteen of baking flour, and suggested that I should put my name down to join the Science and Technology Select Committee. And at the time I thought, nah, it's not for me, because I'm not a white coat and I lack that kind of STEM brain. But I think in some ways it's an indictment on us, in that there was no actual competition to gain membership of the Science and Technology Select Committee, and there was no election. You just put your name down and essentially you could get onto it. And I can tell you from experience that I've had, and similar to Mark, Dr. Downs, of working in East Asia, that a comparable committee or government organisation at a national level offering up such an opportunity would, figuratively have their hand bitten off, because this is what people aspire to master, whilst realizing that the future of the world will be shaped and often decided by science and technology, and by you guys. And we've seen just the heroic work that many people and organizations connected into the COVID-19 response have done, that ultimately allow us to survive. So in fact, when I was elected in December 2019, no one saw the coronavirus rearing its evil head. So colleagues were largely, my colleagues, fellow MPs, were largely kind of focused on getting elected onto what was traditionally the more glamorous of the select committees, like Department of kind of Culture, Media, Digital, Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and the others. But the Science and Technology Select Committee, I would argue, has become, along with maybe the Health Committee, the most central committee to scrutinising the government over the last 12 months. So over these last 12 months, like I said, science and technology has become very much central to the business of Parliament, but also, I believe, to the kind of minds of the nation. And it's been humbling to contribute to recent inquiries. Some of those have been, of course, response to the pandemic, future of telecommunications. And in fact, actually, this morning, I was part of a session whereby we were looking at the vaccine uptake and the extent to which JCVI's prioritisation methods are likely to change. And I do believe that the government is closely following the work that we do on the committee. And what I think this means, and including everyone that's in the audience tonight, is that shows that you are finally getting the respect that you deserve for your professionalism. So obviously the committee's inquiry into the government's handling of COVID-19 is very relevant for the public, but there's other very important inquiries that we're looking into at the moment. So we've had the UK recently has the plans to establish our own version of DARPA or ARPA. And we saw the announcement just in the last week or two, whereby this new UK Science Research Agency has been given the name ARIA, and will come into life next year and over the course of this Parliament. So this may not sound like much to the layman out there, but it has huge potential to give birth to many wacky ideas and solutions of the future. And I guess many of you will have thoughts on how that will look, and I very much so appreciate your thoughts. So just before closing, I think that some of the biological science people I've spoken with in advance of tonight's session, they felt that some of the areas where we are currently facing challenges, not just in the UK, but also globally, is around the funding models and how sometimes you have to kind of shoehorn in your application in order to make it, hopeful of actually getting funding in the end. But there's also the issue around kind of going from fundamental to apply to, it's that age-old problem of finally getting to commercialization, and perhaps some of the issues we have in terms of capital markets or listing of companies in the UK. So again, that's something I think us as a select committee, but also the government need to be looking at. And then ultimately it's, how do we get young people more excited by STEM subjects at as early age as possible? And as much as I love the social scientists, to what extent do you need more people with my kind of background? I think it would be great to try and guide people more into the hard sciences. So I will stop there and hand over to Mark again. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that, Mark. That's a very good oversight of some of your thoughts. And I mean, I suppose you touched on your views about bioscience, but I thought it might be interesting just to hear from you at the outset the way in which the inquiries you've been involved in, particularly probably the COVID ones that you've had so far, have really changed your view of biology and bioscience and what it means. I mean, has it sort of fundamentally change your perception of the value of bioscience and indeed what it actually covers?
Yeah, so I think, Mark, that yes and no, actually, to that question, in that I think what I was getting at earlier about me not being a white coat is that, I know that my own kind of weaknesses in terms of the technical understanding, but I still completely appreciate how important all the sciences are to the makeup of our society and our economy and our ability to be globally competitive. I suppose the very obvious successes that we've seen over the last 11 months since the first initial lockdown, of course, is in terms of pharmacology and vaccinations and vaccinology. And this morning when we've had Professor Sarah Gilbert on from the Jenner Institute, and I remember actually, I think it's exactly a year to this week, is having a briefing from Professor Gilbert, and it was just very humbling to see both the confidence that she had at the time that we would be able to have some form of vaccination, but in this record, short length of time from start to finish to have it actually going out in bulk, and now we have fast approaching 20 million vaccinations across the UK. I mean, that's been absolutely incredible. So that's the yes to your question is that I've just been startled by the speed and effectiveness of everyone involved in this effort.
Okay, thanks. It's great to hear that sort of impact, actually. And there was a question that came in, which is partly related to this beforehand, from Jose Martinez, asking about the education side of for the public more generally, and I think making the point that the public as a whole has suddenly become much more aware of bioscience because of the pandemic. And do you think there's a role that you could play in the committee, perhaps jointly with the Education Committee, to look at education programs for the public more generally, not just on the pandemic, but thinking ahead to things like antimicrobial resistance, losses of biodiversity, climate change? There are all these big global issues which have bioscience at their heart. Do you think that there could be an opportunity for either individual or with the Education Committee to sort of say to the government, we're looking at this because actually we think there needs to be a more dedicated program?
I think it's a great idea because it's looking at the long term, and indeed, as part of the COVID-19 inquiry, we've got two lines of inquiry. One is the response itself, but also is the lessons that have been learnt. And I think that suggestion is a lesson that we are learning, but then how do we make sure that lesson then is shared and taught and understood in the future? So the idea of joining together in select committee works is a great idea, because actually we're currently doing joint select committees. One of those is with Jeremy Hunt and the Health Committee, which has proven to be very, very helpful. I think the core, though, of all these aspects is just kind of, when I think back to my own youth and where I, as a 14-year-old probably found science quite boring, is because I perhaps couldn't see its direct relevance. And if I compare it with, I know yourself, Mark, that you're a Japanese speaker. When you were learning Japanese or doing language training, you could use it straight away with a humanoid. You could actually communicate with them. And so that's everything that was going in, you could kind of regurgitate back out. But perhaps that issue growing up for many kids has just been, it all sounds very theoretical, but how do we apply it? So looking at stuff like AMR, looking at the vaccinations, whatever it happens to be, is just how do you make it that much more tangible for kids and have that as kind of golden thread running through everything?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think that's right. I mean, education is top of the agenda for so many people, and we've seen what value it's had with educating the public and helping everyone to appreciate, the issues that around this complex subject of the pandemic. And I suppose it brings on to a related issue, which is always going to come up in these discussions, which is about science funding. And we've had one question come in. I see where someone's just said, you talked about ARIA and the ARPA model and exploitation of research and that sort of thing. Is that is that the focus of the committee, or do you think actually you equally ought to be looking at fundamental research?
Yeah, so I think that we as a committee welcomed and or a party politically speaking, welcomed last year's announcement by the Chancellor in a budget which subsequently had many changes, obviously. But we welcomed that commitment to the £22 billion for R&D, for science and technology in the UK over the course of this Parliament. So I think that that's a big plus and a big kind of thumbs up to the government's long-term thinking. The DARPA, again, as a committee, we did release a report on this just a number of weeks ago, and we welcome the government's kind of innovation in trying to find other ways to kind of I suppose buttress and help UKRI is to look at that more kind of high risk, high reward type science and technology schemes. I suppose the one area where we still have the question mark with this research agency, with ARIA, is around the focus of the organisation and what we had discovered through the course of the inquiry. I think it was the first or second session we did have the kind of outgoing director of ARPA spoke with us, who's actually a British gentleman, but based in the United States, and he said, the key to the success was that there was always a customer, and in the US's kind of example, it was the Defense Department, DoD, as their kind of end user and end customer. Up until this point, we're still not clear who the customer is for ARIA in the UK. Will it be defence? Will it be kind of health, for example, as the kind of end customer? And that's quite important, because £800 million, it's not an insignificant amount of money, but for the sorts of ambitious projects that we're talking about doing, is that you'll not be able to kind of do that many projects before you'll actually spread yourself quite thin. So that's, to answer the kind of looking at, I suppose, the applied side of things. But on basic research, I think absolutely. And again, that's something that, we'll be looking at the budget next week, in the next week or two, and the kind of the plus points that come off the back of that. But that'll be also something, as we scrutinise government's policy on the select committee, is also, of course, scrutinising budgets and how money's been spent.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple of people. David Hoskins makes the point on the questions that fundamental research investment is really important. So I think it's helpful that you mentioned that there. And Andrew Mackenzie from the Physiological Society is just sort of saying, let's not lose sight, once the pandemic hopefully is suppressed enough, that it's not job done, that there are many other global solutions with bioscience at the heart, which we need to address. So I think there's a sort of quite a sentiment for an agreement with what you're saying there. And again, so I'm just looking at this other screen, which is why my head's moving so much. And there's a question from David Lewis, who says, when you look at the structure of the Science Select Committee, you haven't got a science background. I mean, Catherine Fletcher does, and Caroline Hand does. Do you think that there should be a set number of people, at least a minimum number of people, to have a science background in order to facilitate the discussion in the committee, or do you actually think it doesn't really matter?
I think it's a mixture, actually, Mark, in that it's good to have diversity of thought as much as possible, because if everyone was coming from, say, one sort of form of science background, is that there may be a slight tendency to be ultra sympathetic to the cause, and thus not being perhaps as critical as what you could be. I think on the committee, from where I'm sat and what I can see, we do have the last guest that we had on here a few weeks ago from the science background, as you mentioned, in a few weeks' time, just to do a plug for my select committee colleague, potentially from the SNP, also with a science background. And then we all have Graham Stringer, who is also, I think he was chemical engineering or something like that, as well as a as backgrounds. We do have a few, but it is perhaps something that is not just the select committee, because I think where we perhaps are missing that kind of hard science background, the select committee and the researchers, and we also have, you know, what are technically referred to as special advisors who help us on certain projects. So with telecommunications, for example, where it can get quite techy, we did have someone, you know, kind of brains of Britain who could kind of help explain it to us in layman's terms. So we do have that support network, and actually one thing I would kind of you know, plead with the members this evening is to say that where you have ideas, is that, you know, definitely either unilaterally, you know, send those through to me, or indeed we should look at ways in which we can kind of join up the work that you're doing, Mark, with the select committee and see if there are things we could be doing that are a bit more kind of systematic and doing different briefing sessions throughout the year. But I just, on my last point, I think at a kind of national level, I think that politics would benefit from having an increasing number of people from kind of, you know, a very solid STEM background and having worked in sciences or indeed engineers, for example. If we had more, I think, if those sorts of people coming through, it could be helpful for our ability to govern, because as anyone on this call will have watched, you know, these last few decades, it's been the kind of the lawyers who've came through quite a lot to become members of parliament, and then from kind of, well, Tony Blair, but into David Cameron. Then we had people from a PR and communications and public affairs background, and we have seen quite a lot of that sort of professional experiences coming in, even in the most recent cohort. So perhaps this is your opportunity, if you ever want to everyone, not just you, Mark, but to everyone on this call, if you fancy having a go at the green benches, then there's never been a better time. You've never had it so good in the hard sciences.
Absolutely, I'm sure that's true. Thank you. I mean, and actually, I mean, the other side of the coin about science experience is that, you know, other types of background and diversity of experience are really important too. And perhaps if I can move us on from COVID, you know, slightly for a moment, I mean, your own background in the markets in China, you've had the telecoms inquiry and so on. And we've had a question from Dr. Louise Leon, and she says, you know, from your experience of working in China and, you know, post-Brexit, you know, the UK wants to augment external engagement, but other countries, including Biden's US, you know, want to be more protectionist. You know, China is the world's largest economy. It spends more on R&D than the US. What approach should the UK take in engaging with China's R&D, the supply chain and the economy without compromising governance and ethics and all those sorts of things? I mean, how would you, from your experience, recommend that we engage with that powerhouse?
Yeah, so I think, like every country, right, in our relations with whichever country it happens to be, is that you'll always have a bit of give and take, and a bit of kind of balance and outcomes. You know, much in the way that the UK and the EU signed an agreement at the end of December 2020. And of course, there were things in that the UK government would have wanted more on behalf of kind of British interests. And the same when you look at the EU, and we've, you know, I've in recent conversations with representatives from the French government, you know, they still maintain that they're very sad that we've left, and they wish that wasn't the outcome. You know, you take the example of the United States, and of course we've got, especially within the US, you know, that kind of tussle at the moment between big tech and governance, whether it's in the UK or we've seen what's been happening with Facebook in Australia. So, you know, even between where we have a special relationship between the United States and the UK, is that there's things that we'll not always see 100% eye to eye on. And so when we look at the relationship with China, I think that there's been a lot of great work that's been done over the last 10, 15 years in building the kind of foundations, especially when I think, and there'll be people on this call that have worked closely with the SIN network, or the Science and Innovation Network that's through the SCO. I think it's still called that, Mark. Please correct me in case it's had an evolution of late. But the SIN network, whenever I was based at the British Consulate in Shanghai, we had the great pleasure to be able to announce the Newton Fund in China, which essentially allowed that opportunity for co-collaboration between Chinese and British organisations, and that was something that was very well received. It was good at building trust and building collaboration, because I suppose ultimately as scientists, whether Brexit happens or doesn't, or whether whatever happens, is that you guys for the most part tend not to see borders as much as kind of myopic politicians like myself that thinks that everything is about that kind of unit of 67 million people living in Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So I think that's quite important. So it's about just to the questioner's kind of point. I think it's about trying to find that balance, because there has, of course, I think in global politics there has been a bit of a mood music change from kind of globalization on steroids up until very much so the global financial crisis. And we have seen a wee bit of a move from many countries across the world into slightly more protectionist kind of mentality, and slightly a bit more kind of nationalistic as well. But the UK government has, of course, since last year, has taken several measures in terms of how we do trade, and specifically like in FDI or investment. And so we had in November, for example, the National Security Investment legislation that actually came to the floor of the House for the first time. And broadly speaking, that derives kind of inspiration from the CFIUS program in the United States as well. But I think we should stick to, as the UK, if we're talking about values, we should definitely stick to our openness with as many countries on as many projects as possible. And I truly believe that, unless it's something which really does strike at the core of national security, then I think any country would be kind of expected to protect those aspects.
And if I can just cheekily ask, I mean, Huawei, what was it? Was it a storm in a teacup? Was it a real big issue from your perspective? I mean, were we paranoid and shouldn't have been about 5G?
Well, I think with Huawei, I mean, the key is that last January, February, March time, that the government had made the proclamation that it was safe for Huawei to operate within the UK telecommunications network. It was a risk that was manageable. I mean, Huawei at that time were still branded as a high-risk vendor, but we were confident in that the National Security Cyber Centre, the experience that they had with Huawei over many, many years, and even going back to, I think, 2002 or 3 roughly, whenever Huawei started first to become familiar with the UK market, is that the point that's always been made to us by different government affiliate organisations is that probably outside of Huawei and China, nobody in the world understands Huawei as much as actually the UK does, because of those many years of close collaboration. But the big thing that changed was from that kind of March time, whenever the telecommunications bill passed, was that the United States had updated its own legislation, and it just meant that the semiconductors, it was going to be impossible for Huawei to use United States kind of origin semiconductor technology. And not to get too technical, but then ultimately we at the UK side, the feeling was then that if there were other forms of semiconductors being used, there wouldn't be enough time to vet all that part of the infrastructure. So that was the key change that actually happened during those few months. But of course, I mean, our report from the Select Committee has shown that does make it, the reality is that does make it challenging for us in the UK, because we've gone from 3 providers to only having 2, and where you're reliant just on the 2 providers, one of which Samsung and the other from Ericsson North Europe, is that if one ends up not working technically or whatever, then you could be in all sorts of dire straits. So that's something. Sorry to ramble on, but I think like the key point I'll make on this is that it does suggest to me that the UK has to seriously think about an industrial strategy and really think long term, because a lot of this is my personal view, not necessarily the select committee's view, but my personal view is that it's less actually about blaming China or pointing the finger at the Chinese, because actually I think the Chinese have been very astute and very assiduous, and actually we could have learned something from that in kind of planning for the long term. They've left themselves in the position that they're looking 10, 20, 30 years in advance. And as the whole last year when we were doing the telecommunications inquiry was going on and talking about 5G, I made the point in both private sessions and public sessions is that I can assure you that the Chinese are talking about 6G right now when we're still talking about 5G. So I think the UK, it's not to say, we are a market economy. I'm very proud to be a, kind of buccaneering, free marketeer type country and people. But I think there needs to be aspects, those big issues, and especially those that fall within science and technology, we need to kind of take them by the scruff of the neck a bit more and say, this is the plan we have long term, and make it cross-party. Take the politics out of it and say, in the future, when the pendulum swings and the opposition gets into power, is that we stick to the plan as much as is possible. So I'll kind of finish on that note. I'd be interested in any thoughts people have on industrial strategies.
Yeah, it's an important topic. I mean, certainly as a society, we're very interested in following that through. And there's a number of questions sort of related. I mean, Sophie Denny asked a question about China, and you've partly covered it, so I won't repeat the whole question. But she does make the additional point that a lot of Chinese funding goes into UK universities. Is that something that should universally be welcomed, or are there any problems with that?
So I think, first point I'll make is that, I absolutely welcome Chinese students coming to the UK to study, because, I think to borrow the kind of famous Oxford sinologist Rana Mitter, who I think just last week on the Conservative Party's China Research Group session, like he said, is that the flow of human capital and students coming to the UK is part of a bigger liberal project, because these students kind of have the opportunity to experience the UK, to understand our value system, or our way of life, our political system. So I think it's a great thing to do. Universities themselves, like whether it's on projects or stuff that can tend to be slightly more sensitive, then of course the UK government needs to give more direction to universities and to different faculties and academics on guidance, where we can't expect a university, say in my patch, in the northwest of England, to really know the ins and outs of, China's kind of Leviathan, or its kind of connection between state and society. So I think we in government, we need to give more direction in that regards, Mark. But I'm very open to making sure that we have as many international students from all countries to come to the UK to learn. But it's also something, and this kind of often a slight tangent, but just I'll say very briefly, is that there is an asymmetry in the understanding between the UK and China. We've got at any given time upwards of almost 200,000 Chinese students across kind of primary, secondary, and tertiary level. It's about 125,000 Chinese students at university level in the UK. But the number of British students going across to China is the number's completely dwarfed by the Chinese, and there's only about 365 British students studying Chinese studies at undergraduate. So my experience is that the Chinese understanding, especially in the big cities and the middle classes, their understanding of the UK is 50 times that of our understanding of China. And with it being, as someone pointed out earlier on, I think it was Dr. Leong, with China becoming the largest economy in the world, I think that we have to have a kind of China plus type of understanding. So it's not just China on its own, but it's China plus, biological sciences, China plus chemistry, China plus big tech, in that, any work that we're doing, we need to kind of understand the kind of dynamics and ramifications of that, because it's like, trying to understand your area of expertise without understanding what's going on in the United States. It's very difficult to isolate.
No, okay, thank you very much. That's really interesting to hear, actually. And there's quite a lot of questions coming in. I'm conscious there's not much time left, so I'll try and just rattle through a few, perhaps with some quick answers or your reaction to them at least. There's a couple of education ones. Professor John Coggins is asking, do you think that politicians and people generally really understand the importance of science education at primary level because of the role it plays in enthusing people, young people who go on to secondary school? Do you think that's understood in Parliament?
I'll give short answers for these next few questions. So I absolutely don't think that it's well enough understood. I think there's a huge gap, but therein lies the opportunity. We need to upskill politicians and students.
Okay, thank you. And I mean, it's sort of slightly related to this. I mean, Hilary McQueen asks, there's a strong drive, she says, all the way from the UN that people should be educated to think like a scientist. And perhaps we could debate whether that's a good idea or not. But do you think that this is a good idea for the country? Are we pushing enough formal education, the sort of approach to scientific thinking, or is that perhaps going too far? Do you think we do enough?
Think like it's hard to say, because I don't think like a scientist.
I'm not sure whether I do or not either, but I think it's something that people do ask. It's that sort of methodology, the scientific method, and whether you feel that that's something which could be useful in a wider educational context, or actually, or not. I mean, you may not feel that.
Well, I'm a social scientist, right? And then everyone's going to go, oh, no, I'm a social scientist, God forbid. And I know social scientists, have this real inferiority complex, because we do try to bring the scientific approach to how we analyze things, and we talk in scientific language like dependent and independent variables and whatnot. So I think it's a good thing, because and I should have said this at the top, actually, is that I'm very sympathetic to the work of scientists and its importance for us as a country and a people. So I mean, you'll seldom find me in the camp of being science skeptic at all. So I think anything which kind of helps bring people to a bit more of a less emotional approach to things, although the emotion's still important, but just being a little bit more kind of balanced and logical is a good thing. Okay,
and there are lots of people who are asking about biodiversity and the descriptor review and those sorts of things. I don't know how much involvement you've had in the biodiversity debate in the past, but it's a bit like the current pandemic, where people didn't necessarily know about those issues. Biodiversity is perhaps put in a sort of box of a particular thing that's interested a small part of the community, whereas actual fact it's quite clear it has a massive impact on all our lives, and from the different uses of land and sea and so on. Do you think biodiversity is something which the select committee ought to spend a bit more time focusing on? I mean, is it something that we could persuade you to spend more time on? Because I think it's become a big topic. I mean, it always has been, I guess, but it's recently with the descriptor review, it's really hit the headlines.
Yeah, I just wonder if maybe that may be something that lends itself well to working across select committees within the House of Commons. It might actually be good one, because I'm trying to think. I mean, of course, COVID-19 has been incredibly macro, but a lot of what we've looked into, so we've got telecommunications, we've done ARPA, and also actually hydrogen is commencing in next week or the week after we start that inquiry. So a lot of what we're doing is it's got like an applied stroke kind of commercial interest. We're just thinking, how can this be good for, I suppose, UK PLC at the end of the day? Whereas with biodiversity, I think, again, the challenge will be to parliamentarians and the select committees, like, how do you kind of make it tangible for people? Because it kind of can seem like a big thing, and we think, we're not going to touch that. Well, there's no solutions here from us.
Okay, fine. Well, so perhaps they're just making sure. I mean, I think the descriptor review will do a lot of that anyway, but actually just making clear the impact of it and the link to everyday life is perhaps something which would be helpful. And perhaps as we move towards the end, there's another quick question from Les Rose, who asks, he says works for charity Health Watch, campaigning about evidence-based healthcare, and it's actually a generic question saying that there should be better regulation of the consumer healthcare sector, and we'd like probably the Health Select Committee to look at this in more detail. How best to get a select committee to focus in on an issue, whether it's this one or something else? What would be your recommendation on how to do that?
The best thing would be, as an organisation, the RSB, for example, is to kind of liaise very closely with our clerks and with the chair. There's Science and Technology on the Health Committee front. Also lobbying. So I don't know if Ms. Fletcher was lobbied last week on this issue, but you should definitely bring this question up again whenever the next speaker comes through, just so that we have it kind of top of mind.
Okay, fine. That's good, and I think we're, as you know, we are always happy to try and collate views and put them in from the society, as you say. So that would be great. It is 1 minute to 7, and we're supposed to be finishing at 7 o'clock. I'm afraid we haven't got through even half the questions which have come in on the Q&A online, or indeed the ones that were submitted beforehand. But we've sort of skirted around education and some of the Chinese stuff and the COVID pandemic and so on. So I think we've covered a fair amount of ground. Just before we finish, Mark, is there anything else you haven't said that you'd just like to say before we finish?
Well, I think I'm relieved that no one's asked me to explain anything in a hard sciencey type of way, because it might have hit Newsnight this evening or BBC Breakfast News tomorrow morning. So thank you for being very, very lenient on me this evening. But I mean, the main thing I would say is just, do, and I mean this, like do keep in contact. You can find me on LinkedIn if you're using it. But if there is something you feel very strongly about, whether it's on the research funding side, or like we've talked about education, what's kind of, if you have a silver bullet or a panacea, like how can we improve these elements? Because the last year has definitely put you guys front and center. So I think now is the time to kind of maximize the kind of influence that your work can actually have, because it's going to make us healthier, it's going to make us more prosperous in the future. So with that, I'll just say thank you for taking the time, and thank you to Mark and the team at RSB for hosting me this evening.
You're very welcome. Then thank you very much for giving your time to join us. I know you've got another event to go on to, so we'll let you go. And we hope to see you virtually or in person at one of the select committee meetings in the not too distant future. So thank you very much. For those of you who are watching, there is a survey that's just been posted. If you wouldn't mind filling it in, that would be hugely appreciated. Thank you very much. And we'll let you know the dates for our next one with Carol Monaghan from the SNP. We hope that'll be during March. So do watch this space. So thank you very much, and good night to everyone. Thank you, Mark.